Hi, everybody. Welcome. We are here to share with you some great stories about Elliot Eisner and also a discussion of educational connoisseurship and criticism, the method that Eisner engendered for qualitative research. And in particular, we're talking about our book, Using Educational Criticism and Connoisseurship for Qualitative Research. And I'm super excited to be here with Bruce Uhrmacher, who is my advisor at University of Denver, and also Dave Flinders, who is my life advisor, and I'm lucky to know him. We're here to just chat and tell you a little bit about Eisner, about this method, and then how this book might be helpful for you. So to get things started, we wanted to first ask two of Eisner's students that we have here, Bruce and Dave, what was it like to be Eisner's student? Tell us a little bit about that.
So I'm going to jump in here. And first, actually, I wanted to say a few things about Elliot. Many people watching this may not know who he is or who he was. Just a few descriptors. Elliot Eisner was the Lee Jacks Professor of Education and Art at Stanford University. He held 5 honorary degrees, and he was elected to membership in the Royal Society of Arts in the United Kingdom, the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences and Letters, and the National Academy of Education in the United States. He was president of all sorts of associations: National Art Education Association, American Educational Research Association, the John Dewey Society, and the list goes on and on. He wrote over 700 invited papers, over 270 articles, and over 20 books. So I wanted to get that in there. Apologize for reading. I do have a story, but I'm going to let David go first.
Thanks, Bruce. I first met Elliot simply by taking one of his courses in curriculum theory. And it was kind of strange how I ended up in the course. I applied to Stanford as a graduate student in a program called the Design and Evaluation of Educational Programs. It was called the DEEP program. I was admitted, but I was not quite sure the scope and nature of the program. And I talked with one of the faculty, and he said, this program is for people interested in either curriculum studies or teacher education. I had been through a teacher education program, and I didn't think I was interested in that. And so by default, I wasn't quite sure what curriculum studies was. By default, I said, I'll go curriculum studies, and this person says, okay, you need to take a course by Elliot Eisner. Later, by the way, that same day, I asked people, what is curriculum? I knew it had something to do with subject matter, but some teaching friends of mine said, oh, it has to do with textbooks. And I thought, oh gosh, I've made a terrible mistake. I'm not interested in textbooks at all. And so here I am, brand new graduate student, and I'm in the wrong program, but I went to Elliot's class anyway. And he began the class by talking about basic curriculum questions. What do schools teach? What should they teach? Who should decide? What knowledge is of most worth? These questions I bought into immediately. I just love those questions. And was by the end of, 2 hours earlier, I wasn't sure what curriculum studies was, but after the first class, I decided that I was going to be a curriculum studies scholar. Really with Elliot being one of his students, he was my doctoral advisor. It was kind of a matter of keeping up with Elliot. He was always doing stuff, always writing, always got projects going on. And it was just a delight to be able to observe him work during my time at Stanford.
I came to Stanford about 5 years, I think, after you, David. And I remember you're just talking, and you said, Elliot is always so much more relaxed at home. He really sort of grounded at home. If you caught him in his office, his mind was moving in 15 different directions, and it was a whirlwind. You'd get a couple minutes, maybe 15, and it was always a little intense. So I decided early on, because Elliot gave me the option. He would say to me, I can meet with you at my home, or I can meet with you in my office. So given David's advice, I always took the home. Now, at home, he always wanted it early in the morning too. I was not a particularly morning person, but between 8 o'clock at Elliot's house or 1 in the afternoon at work, I always took the 8 in the morning. And that worked really well. You were right. And so the story here is that he was a very intense fellow. He was very demanding of himself as well as his students. But he could relax, and if you caught him at the right time, that was great.
I think a lot of people know that Elliot Eisner was a champion for qualitative research in general. But can you all talk about why Eisner designed educational criticism and connoisseurship? And what are some of his foundational ideas?
I remember that educational criticism and connoisseurship, that some people have some problems with the term connoisseurship, not just because it's French, but because it has certain kind of elitist overtones to it. And I remember when I felt a little bit hesitant in my dissertation. I used educational connoisseurship and criticism after having learned to spell connoisseurship, by the way. But I was a little bit, I used to joke with my friends because I didn't think of myself as a connoisseur, so I'd call myself a junior connoisseur. But for Elliot, connoisseurship was not elitist in any sense. He believed that the object of connoisseurship, what we come to know about, can be in any domain of learning. Really, the object of connoisseurship is anything that people really care about, from wine, the wine connoisseur, to collecting baseball cards or something like that. It really can be anything. And it comes from a Greek root that means to know, connoisseurship. It's the same Greek root that we get the word cognition from. But that's critically important because the function of qualitative research, Elliot believed, was to increase one's connoisseurship, to learn. And in that sense, it makes educational research, all educational research should be educational in the sense that we learn from it. But what we refer to as educational research is educational in two ways. We not only study educational topics, but we do so with the purpose of educating ourselves. So I think that's a really basic concept to connoisseurship. And it means that connoisseurship really is both a means and an ends to educational criticism.
So I'll mention that when I work with graduate students, they sometimes say, I don't know if I could do this. I'm not a connoisseur in this area. And what I point out, what David was alluding to, is connoisseurship is a continuum. And the minute you start reading about something, you're actually already ahead on the continuum. And so you read a lot, you experience a lot. And so no, you don't need to be a connoisseur, meaning some kind of expert at the start. So Elliot would tell the story that he came up with parts of this method anyway while he was in the shower. So if you look at his career, he thought through what the arts mean for the educational enterprise. Curriculum is an art, teaching is an art, evaluation is an art. And so he was thinking, if teaching is an art, then doesn't it make sense to think about it, appraise it in the same way an art critic might critique visual art? And so I think that was kind of the beginning of his thinking. And he studied art criticism and of course the arts. And he came up with a way that he could borrow, if you will, from art criticism and apply those ideas to the educational world through this method of criticism and connoisseurship. And connoisseurship is the art of appreciation, as Elliot would say. Criticism is the art of disclosure. And what was brilliant about defining criticism in that way is he didn't say it had to be a particular kind of disclosure. He left the field quite open to disclose in many, many different forms and ways.
A lot of my students want to know why they should use educational criticism and connoisseurship, and if their topic would be appropriately addressed through educational criticism and connoisseurship. And one of the things that I like to tell them is that you can really study almost anything with EdCrit, and many topics are appropriate or could be so. But in particular, the topics that I think, and I'd like to hear from you all as well, lend themselves well to educational criticism are topics that would benefit from really looking at nuance, or looking at a topic that might have multiple perspectives, or we could look at it from different theories and have conversations about even a familiar situation, but looking at it in a new way. Those are kinds of topics and studies that might really lend themselves well to EdCrit. And the other thing I like to talk about with my students is that, as Dave mentioned earlier, curriculum is any sort of form of curriculum that we want to study, whether it's formal or informal or in schools or in other institutions. Curriculum is really a great, or EdCrit is really a great way to study curriculum. And we can look at different types of curriculum: hidden curriculum, complementary, shadow, the null, the implicit. And we can either look specifically at those kinds of curricula, or we can use those ideas to evaluate and interpret the data as they come to life. And then one of the things we also talk about in our book, using educational criticism and connoisseurship for qualitative research, is Eisner's ecology of schooling. And I think this is really useful to students who are studying education topics, is to understand the relationship between intentions, curriculum, pedagogy, school structures, and evaluation, and also school and community relations, and perhaps even place. But that when we look at Eisner's ecology of schooling, it's a great way to organize a criticism. And then also we talk about in the book the instructional arc, and a lot of educational criticisms use the instructional arc in their research questions. What are the intentions? The arc looks at intentions. What are teachers' intentions or clinicians' intentions? Operations, how are those intentions manifested or operationalized? How do they come to life? And then received, how are those intentions received, either by students or whoever the participants are. So looking over that instructional arc, educational criticism can look at each of those individually, or can look at them as a whole, each of those elements as a whole, and really understand nuance, idiosyncrasies, particularly in the received. And looking at a classroom as an example, we oftentimes should and do have intentions for students, but if they don't walk away having taken with them those particular intentions, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a bad thing. It means that we can understand what they've received, what they've walked away with, and try to understand what might be of value to that student, or what I might learn from as a teacher going to teach that similar lesson again. So the sort of answer to the question of what kinds of topics, all kinds of topics, particularly ones related to curriculum or looking at intentions in a setting. And then I also wanted to mention Eisner. One of the things that my students love about using EdCrit is that Eisner provides this really elegant and beautiful and also complex structure that we affectionately call the diet: description, interpretation, evaluation, and thematics. And having those stages or elements or components of a research methodology is really helpful to understand not only the process of observing and collecting data, conducting interviews, conducting analysis, but then what do we do once we've done this analysis? How do we know how to deeply analyze data? What do we do with things that don't quote unquote fit? And Eisner gives us a lot of ideas and particular ways to work through data analysis. And so, Bruce, I was hoping that maybe you would talk next a little bit about data analysis in EdCrit.
Sure. And one quick word about where this can be used. Lately, I have dropped the word education from the title of this method. I teach courses now in a research methods and statistics program, and I have students who are not in the field of education, and they can utilize this method quite well. So I refer to it now as criticism and connoisseurship. And I could go on about that, but I'm not. So you said data analysis. So our book pointed out 3 terms: global annotations, pattern finding annotations, and cross-checking annotations. And what we're trying to do is not use the word coding. Honestly, I'm tired of the word coding, especially in a method that's derived from the arts and humanities. So when you think about what you might have done in analyzing a novel or a poem, you didn't code it. you annotated it, you read it thoroughly numerous times, and eventually you started to look for patterns. So the book starts out with three kinds of analysis, if you will, three kinds of annotation. And since then, we've been developing others because we knew even when we wrote the book that those weren't all the kinds of annotations one does. So now we have global, which is the idea that you look everything over, pattern finding, where you look for contours of meaning, nuanced annotations. This method is all about the nuance. So really pay attention to nuances. Then we still use the word cross-checking, which is the idea that we create themes across the various criticisms you might have in a work, and dissenting annotations, which is like discrepant case analysis. Be your own best critic.
So now that we have a bit of an understanding of the path to analysis, Dave, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about description and interpretation, and what does that look like in an ed crit? What's description like in an ed crit versus maybe some other methods, or what are some highlights that you would want to share?
Diet, description, interpretation, evaluation, and thematics is a very nifty little analytic tool, and I find it particularly useful in terms of thinking of all qualitative researchers are also writers. And what's great about Diet is that it helps me focus on, as a writer, what am I doing at this point? Am I describing? Am I interpreting? I have a tendency to jump ahead, and that's not a good tendency because if it trips me up. But Diet, the first point I want to make is that Diet is not a hierarchy. Even though in a typical educational criticism, you often find sections on interpretation, on description, interpretation, evaluation, and thematics, that doesn't imply that certain components of Diet are more important than others. I particularly enjoy description because of its openness. I can be as literary or as not literary as I want to be in describing it, as long as I get vivid portrayals of what I've seen and heard in my research and in the fieldwork part of my research. Description, I think, is particularly important. You want to provide a vivid enough description so that it can be experienced by the reader in some way, and I used to discount description a little bit. Harry Walcott, the educational anthropologist, he and I used to argue quite a bit because I would take the side of theory and argue that theory is important. He would take the side of description and argue that description was important. And over the many years of my career, I've actually come to agree with Harry on that point. That its description is what readers often remember, long after they've forgotten the theory that's informed interpretation or your thematics and so forth. It's for me, when I read qualitative research, it's those highly descriptive parts that kind of stick with me. Interpretation is simply, it shades over into description. But interpretation is simply making sense of what you've seen or heard, and that often involves some theory to it about which we try and be relatively explicit, providing the readers with the tool. But even description is interpretive in the sense that what we're describing is often someone else's interpretation. That is, we're trying to figure out what something means to a student or to a teacher or to a principal or whatever the case may be. And interpretation helps that process.
What I love about the way Eisner talks about evaluation is it's really about what is a value here to those involved. And that's an incredibly powerful question to ask ourselves as researchers, that we're not saying something is good or bad. That's not the point of this type of evaluation. What we're trying to help people see is something in a new way. And the evaluation and thematic components of a criticism really help us understand the upshot, or what is it all up to here. And as Eisner says, that's his. I love that Eisner can say the most complex, beautiful thing in such a simple way. What is it all up to? And evaluation really focuses on the appraisal of the research that's being done, the research context, in relationship to the research questions, which and also in relationship to some set of criteria or some theory that we're looking at. And then in terms of thematics, that's where we can really think about those big threads of ideas that are woven throughout our data. We can bring together lots of different data sources, from interviews to observations to really interesting artifact analysis, or photographs from our participants that they might share with us, or that we might take, or other arts-based data collection tools. And bringing all of those together to tell the story is really where evaluation and thematics comes to life. And one of the things that I really appreciate when critics do is when they use words or dialogue or phrases that come directly from their participants or directly from that context to then title or label those themes. It brings a real literary element to their work, and it also really brings their voices to life. And so that's one of the things that I love most about EdCrit, is the way it really is a nice complement between researcher and participants, and it's a way for the researcher to help voices be heard, perhaps in a new way, and also for, Dave had mentioned earlier, that it really is an educational enterprise, meaning everyone involved gets to learn, the researcher, the participants, those who read the study write-up, that it really is about a learning process, and it should be enlightening and interesting in some way.
I'll just mention that George and Louise Spindler, also educational anthropologists, mentioned that description they felt was the most important thing. Theories come and go. A lot of old theories are terrible now, but the descriptions can remain.
What would you all like graduate students to know? And what would you like perhaps their professors to know, or anyone who might be considering taking up EdCrit?
I think one thing is, I would like you to know that there are many ways to utilize this method. And in chapter 6 of the book, by the way, we point out possible new directions. One direction is the idea of auto-criticism. In the same way that there's auto-ethnography, there is auto-criticism, and some of my students have started writing in that way. I think some of Christy's as well. I'll just give a shout out to Monica Rizak and Melanie Witt, should anyone want to pursue their works. I would also suggest that this work could be tied into arts-based methods, generally speaking. You can include visuals and poems to enhance the story you're telling. And Jen Gutierrez is one person who did that in her dissertation. And finally, Elliot used the language of prefigured and emergent foci. And the idea is that you could come in with a point of view that you want to use to look at your environment. So, and that's a good thing to do. But you also want to be careful and be aware of what's going on from the environment that you may not have thought about while you're sitting in your office. And that's the emergent point of view. So you need a balance of, I think, prefigured, which is coming in with a conceptual framework, and emergent foci. And I know a lot of students are interested in critical race theory, environmental issues, gender issues, and conceptual frameworks from each of these areas can be utilized with criticism and connoisseurship.
What I think of, I'm trying to, I've written a lot of educational criticisms and used this method quite a bit. And I think what I enjoy most, or what I appreciate most about the method, is the way Elliot taught it to me. It was a pretty loose-limbed and highly flexible method, that there was no one right way to do educational criticism, that there was a good deal of latitude on the part of the writer, the critic. And I've always felt more liberated in doing this kind of research than in many other kinds of research that I've had experience with.
I would like to invite anyone watching this video to consider using the method and also to contribute to its conceptual underpinnings. As David just mentioned, it's not a done deal here. It's not like there's a method and everyone applies it. It's growing, and I encourage you to help it grow in range and focus.
Thanks, everyone. And please also feel free to reach out to us. We would love to hear your ideas, and we'd love to share even more details with you. So Bruce is at University of Denver. I'm at University of Northern Colorado, and Dave Flinders is in California on the beach. So you'll have to find him there.